A while ago, a long time ago, Croatian television filmed an interview with Franjo Tuđman in the presidential palace on Pantovčak.
Prije dosta vremena hrvatska televizija intervjuirala pokojnog predsjednika Tuđmana na Pantovčaku.
And it was informal, it was kind of slow, they were wandering around, Tuđman was showing various things that were in the palace.
I taj intervju je bio dosta neformalan, on je njih vodio okolo po toj palači i pokazivao im stvari.
And at one point, the interviewer just stopped and looked at this statue.
U jednom trenutku se intervju zaustavio i fokusirali su na nekakav kip.
The statue of Tito.
I to je bio Titov kip.
And says to Tuđman, like, why is this? What's this about?
I taj čovjek koji ga je intervjuirao je pitao, zapanjio se, pitao ga, pa šta ovo radi tu?
And Tuđman sort of was silent for a moment and said, Tito, a very complex person.
A Tuđman se malo zamislio, za trenutak je bio tiho i onda je rekao, da, Tito, jako komplicirana osoba.
I saw this years later after we'd moved to Croatia, and it just struck me so much, that kind of interaction.
I taj sam ja intervju vidio nakon nekoj godina što smo došli u Hrvatsku i jako me je zapanjio.
Do you think about Tuđman excelled under Tito's system? He became the youngest general in the army at one point.
Tuđman je pod Titom zapravo jako puno napredovao, bio je najmlađi general u jednom trenutku.
Then he was successful in sports and in academics.
I bio je uspješan i u sportu i u obrazovanju.
But then his developing views on Croatian autonomy got him put in jail twice.
Ali onda je razvijao to razmišljanje o hrvatskoj autonomiji i završio je u zatvoru 2 puta.
So, Tuđman is probably the single most important historical character in demolishing what Tito built.
I Tuđman je možda najvažnija povijesna osoba koja je uništila to što je Tito izgradio.
But he kept Tito's statue in the presidential palace in Croatia.
Ali je u toj predsjedničkoj palači Hrvatskoj zadržao ipak Titov kip.
Called him a complex person, owed him a lot.
I nazvao ga je kompleksnom osobom i zapravo bio mu je puno dužan.
So what do you do with that?
I što misliti o tome?
History is very, very complex.
Povijest je jako komplicirana.
Oftentimes stories are very hard to figure out. Wait, weren't they enemies? Like, how did this work?
I često je teško razumjeti različite priče i često se pitamo, gle, pa zar oni nisu bili neprijatelji?
And what do you do with that with the Bible?
I kako to, kako o tome razmišljamo u Bibliji?
Do we run away from complex, weird stories to find simple stories in the Bible?
Bježimo li od tih čudnih, kompliciranih priča iz Biblije i utječemo se onim jednostavnima?
Can we bring the Bible to complex stories?
Možemo li donijeti Bibliju u komplicirane priče?
Does it have anything to do with history at all?
Ima li ikakve veze s poviješću uopće?
I think it does, and that's what we're going to talk about this morning.
Ja mislim da ima i o tome ćemo razgovarati jutros.
I can think of another story that has some eerie similarities.
I zapravo mislim na jednu priču koja ima čudne sličnosti sa ovom pričom koju sam vam sad ispričao.
A young leader goes up the ranks in the military under an older warrior.
Jedan mladi vođa se penje po ljestvici uspjeha pod jednim starijim vojskovođom.
Then he becomes a threat to the old leader.
I onda mu u jednom trenutku postane prijetnja.
And he's persecuted for it.
I zato ga progone.
But he outlives the old leader. The old leader eventually dies.
Ali on nadživi tog starog vođu koji na kraju umre.
And eventually he takes over and he also changes the regime that had existed before.
I na kraju on isto naslijedi taj režim koji mijenja taj režim koji je postojao prije njega.
Can you hear the echoes of the story of David and Saul?
I zapravo, dakle, to je priča o Davidu i Šaulu.
Anytime you talk about Bible and politics or history, it's a minefield.
I svaki put kad pričate o Bibliji i o povijesti, zapravo to je kao rudnik prepun stvari za naći.
No, minefield, like
minefield, oprostite, kao minsko polje.
And I'm very aware of that.
I vrlo sam toga svjestan.
But I've been in this book for quite some time, and I think it has a lot to say to us.
I dosta sam vremena proveo u ovoj knjizi, prvoj Samuelovoj, i mislim da ima jako puno toga za reći nama.
Especially in a season where, once again, politics has become extremely divisive and very, very sensitive.
I posebno u vremenu u kojem se sad nalazimo, gdje je politika ponovno vrlo podijeljena.
I am not going to tell you how to vote next week.
Neću vam reći kako trebate glasati sljedeći tjedan.
I'm not going to tell you what to think about things.
A neću vam ni reći što trebate misliti o stvarima.
But I hope to give you a mindset and a frame in which to enter your thinking about these things.
Ali želim vam dati okvir unutar kojeg ćete moći onda razmišljati o ovim stvarima.
The book of Samuel in the Bible
U toj knjizi Samuelovoj, prvoj,
is a masterpiece.
Zapravo ta knjiga je remek djelo.
It tells an incredibly difficult story.
Priča o jednoj vrlo teškoj priči.
It tells it with incredible thoughtfulness and skill.
I priča je sa takvom vještinom i takvom opreznošću.
Remember, it became 1st and 2nd Samuel in the way it was when it got translated into Greek, and so in all of our Bibles it's labeled as 1st and 2nd Samuel, but it's really one big long book.
Zapravo, kad je prevedena na grčki, postala je prva Samuelova i druga, međutim u originalu je zapravo jedna velika knjiga.
Spending a lot of time in Samuel over the past couple of years really has helped me to become, I think, more sympathetic to others who disagree with me.
Čitajući, provodeći puno vremena u ovoj knjizi kroz zadnjih nekoliko godina me učinilo, dalo mi je nekako suosjećanje za ljude koji se sa mnom ne slažu.
Helped me become less impatient.
Pomoglo mi je da postanem manje nestrpljiv.
I think it's a really important book for us today.
I mislim da je ta knjiga jako važna za nas danas.
We live in a day where angry tribalism in the way we think about things is growing again everywhere.
I zapravo živimo u vremenu koje karakterizira nekako ljute plemenske borbe.
And see, because the book of Samuel is all about this movement towards one unified kingdom under the tribe of Judah, under the line of David.
I kroz ovu knjigu zapravo gledamo nekakav pokret prema jednom ujedinjenom plemenu koje vodi, what did you say?
The tribe of Judah.
Koje vodi Judino plemen pod Davidom.
And it makes no apologies for that, and it establishes that was God's will.
I za to se knjiga ne ispričava, dakle zapravo naglašava da je to Božja volja.
But along the way, it shows such incredible sympathy for the losers of history.
Ali kroz sve to pokazuje jednu izvjesnu simpatiju za one koji su izgubili.
A noted Hebrew scholar named Robert Alter says this book borders on subversion.
I ova knjiga, jedan poznati znanstvenik Robert Alter kaže da ova knjiga na neki način je subverzivna.
That if you told the story of Croatia's history in the last 20 years the way this story is told, people would probably get really angry at you.
Kad biste hrvatsku povijest ispričali u zadnjih 20 godina na ovaj način na koji je ova knjiga napisana, ljudi bi se na vas naljutili.
If you told the story of the Bush administration in the United States this way, everybody would be mad because it shows all sides of the picture.
Kad biste isto pričali, ne znam, o Bushovom vladanju u Americi na ovaj način, isto bi se ljudi naljutili jer ova priču sa svih strana.
We're most used to thinking about this book in terms of maybe Sunday school lessons like David versus Goliath.
I često smo navikli na ovu knjigu razmišljati o njoj kao u obliku nekakvih lekcija za nedeljnu školu, kao David i Golijat, na primjer.
Or we use it for very personal devotions, like to look at why Saul is rejected and then why David isn't.
Za naše osobnu pobožnost kad razmišljamo o tome zašto je David prihvaćen, zašto je Šaul odbijen od Boga.
But that's not what the author of this book was really struggling with in writing it down.
Ali to nije bila namjera autora, to nije bilo nešto čim se on borio kad je pisao ovu knjigu.
He was working very, very hard to show that God's purposes were real in history, maybe a generation later.
On je pokušavao pokazati da je Božja namjera u povijesti stvarna i pisao je to možda jednu generaciju poslije.
But he also knew he couldn't escape. He couldn't not tell certain stories that everybody would stand up and say, I see that you're being political about this. You're ignoring what happened and so and so.
Isto tako nije zaobilazio nekakve scene i situacije zbog kojih bi mu se neko mogao ustati i reći vidim da si političan oko toga.
Saul was the king of Israel for 40 years.
Šaul je bio kralj Izraela 40 godina.
About. Under him, Israel moved out from being this kind of always getting run over continually by the Philistines or by other tribes.
I pod njim je Izrael, dakle, prestali su biti oni koji stalno ih neko pobjeđuje, Filistejci i ostali.
And started to become independent, although somewhat, precarious.
I počeli su biti više manje neovisni.
And his reign was the peak of power and of influence for the tribe of Benjamin.
I njegova vladavina je dakle bila vrhunac vlasti tog plemena Benjaminovog.
And so this book shows an awful lot of sympathy for what it cost Benjamin to be the losers of history.
I ova priča zapravo pokazuje jako detaljno što je značilo za te Benjaminovce da budu ti gubitnici u povijesti.
And so we're going to just walk through this and take a couple different looks at examples of how this book treats history.
I zato ćemo sad proći ćemo kroz to, pogledat ćemo nekoliko primjera kako se ova knjiga nosi s poviješću.
It's important to remember this book is 3,000 years old.
Dakle, ova knjiga je stara oko 3000 godina.
And you look at what was being any kind of literature we have that remains from that period of the world.
I ako gledamo na bilo kakvu drugu literaturu iz tog razdoblja vezanu za povijest svijeta.
You have mythical legends like the Iliad.
Imamo mitske legende poput Ilijade.
And you have these obnoxiously self-justifying sort of Babylonian kings, accounts of their own reigns.
I nekakve priče o babilonskim kraljevima koji su puni sami sebe.
And yet this book shows real characters with all sorts of flaws.
A ova knjiga prikazuje stvarne ljude sa raznim slabostima.
I mean, you could almost think that somebody wrote this in the last 50 years.
I mogli biste pomisliti da je ovo neko napisao u zadnjih 50 godina.
And the way that it develops its characters and it shows you people who have a mix of good and bad.
Na način na koji razvija te osobe i pokazuje da su ljudi miks dobrog i lošeg.
Okay, we're just going to stop at a few places and just point out some things about the way Samuel tells history.
Dakle, zaustavit ćemo se na nekoliko mjesta i pokazati primjer kako Samuel govori o povijesti.
First one I'd like to just mention is that Samuel shows that faithful history starts with small and maybe seemingly unimportant events.
Dakle, Samuel prikazuje, prvu stvar koju ćemo spomenuti je Samuel prikazuje kako povijest započinje nekim malim, gotovo čini se nevažnim stvarima.
This book does not start out with kings.
I ova knjiga ne započinje kraljem.
It starts out with a woman who is very, very discouraged and depressed.
Započinje pogledom na jednu ženu koja je vrlo obeshrabrena i deprimirana.
Because she can't give birth to a child, and that meant so much for her stature in that society.
Jer ne može imati dijete, a to je u tadašnje vrijeme bilo jako značajno, da se može roditi dijete.
And God gave her a child, and she was so excited to have this child that she dedicated the child to God.
I kad joj je Bog uslišao molitvu i dao joj dijete, ona je bila toliko ushićena da je to dijete posvetila Bogu.
So Hannah, the mother, gave her son Samuel to serve in the temple at a young age.
I tako je Hana predala svog sina Samuela da služi Bogu u hramu, kad je bio još jako mali.
And just one little verse here.
I samo jedan mali kratki stih.
1 Samuel 2:19. Each year his mother made of him a little robe and took it to him when she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. And Eli would bless Elkanah his wife, saying, "May the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord." And then they would go home.
Dakle, 1. Samuelova 2.19 kaže ovako. Mati bi mu njegova napravila dolamicu i donosila mu je svake godine kad bi dolazila s mužem svojim da prinese godišnju žrtvu. A Eli bi blagoslovio Elkanu i njegovu ženu govoreći: neka ti Jahve dade poroda od te žene, na uzdar je za dar što ga je dala Jahvi. Na to bi se vraćali svoje kuće.
What kind of history tells stories like that?
I kakva povijest započinje ili priča takve priče?
It starts with little things.
Započinje s malim stvarima.
Everything matters.
Sve je važno.
You never know what the love that you extend to another person is going to mean in a bigger picture.
I nikad ne znate što će nekakav čin ljubavi koji učinite nekome značiti u jednoj velikoj slici.
You will never find something like this in any ancient history aside from the Bible.
I nikad ovakvu jednu scenu nećete naći ni u jednoj drevnoj povijesnoj knjizi osim u Bibliji.
That would bother to think who cares about what women think?
Koja bi mislila uopće, je li važno uopće što žene misle?
Or what a mother experiences?
ili kroz što mati prolazi.
And yet that's where this book starts.
Ali to je ono s čim započinje ova knjiga.
The next point I'd like to make as we go through here would be that faithful history is truthful even when it makes our heads spin because it's so complicated.
Druga stvar na koju želimo obratiti pažnju je da je istinita, iskrena povijest iskrena bez obzira na teškoće, na neke
Even if it makes our heads spin.
Čak i ako nam se od toga vrti u glavi.
It tells the stories on both sides even when it adds up to something you're not even quite sure what to make of yourself.
I govori priču sa obje strane, dakle, s obje strane novčića, čak i kad nas dovede u situaciju da ne znamo što misliti.
And this is a weird one. This in 1 Samuel. So Samuel grows up to be a prophet, leads the nation for a long time.
Dakle, ovo je situacija gdje je Samuel odrastao i postaje prorok i vodi narod već neko duže vrijeme.
But the man who basically raised Samuel was the priest Eli in the temple.
A čovjek koji je odgojio Samuela je taj svećenik Eli u hramu.
He had two evil sons.
Imao je dva sina koji su bili zli.
God judged them and they died.
I Bog ih je osudio i oni su umrli.
And Samuel saw this growing up as sort of like a foster son to this situation.
I Samuel je bio svjedokom ove situacije. On je bio kao posvojeni sin Elijev.
He was a great leader in Israel.
Bio je veliki vođa u Izraelu.
But he also had two sons.
Ali isto imao dva sina.
And what we find here is they also grew up to be evil.
I ono što ovdje nalazimo je da su i oni odrasli i postali zli.
So when Samuel grew old, he appointed, this is 1 Samuel 8, verse 1 starting. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, "Listen to all the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king."
Okay. To su stihovi u 8. poglavlju od 1 do 8, od 1 do 7. Kad je Samuel ostario, postavio je svoje sinove za sudca u Izraelu. Njegov prvorođenac zvao se Joel, a drugi sin Abija. Oni su bili suci u Beeršebi, ali sinovi nisu išli stopama očevim. Gledali su na svoj dobitak, primali mito i izvrtali pravicu. Tada se skupiše sve starješine izraelske i dođeše k Samuelu u Ramu i rekoše mu: "Eto, ti si ostario, a tvoji sinovi ne idu tvojim stopama. Postavi nam dakle kralja da nam vlada, kao što je to kod svih naroda." Ali Samuelu nije bilo drago što su rekli: "Daj nam kralja da nam vlada." Zato se Samuel pomoli Jahvi. A Jahve reče Samuelu: "Poslušaj glas naroda u svemu što od tebe traži, jer nisu odbacili tebe, nego su odbacili mene, ne želeći da ja kraljujem nad njima."
One of the big themes in the Old Testament is that God should have been the king over Israel himself.
Jedna od velikih tema u Starom Zavjetu je to da je Bog trebao biti kralj nad Izraelom.
And we see right here that it was the people were rejecting not Samuel but God and asking for a king.
I ovdje vidimo da ljudi tražeći kralja ne odbacuju Samuela, nego odbacuju Boga kao kralja. Ali
Samuel himself is not being all that good in this moment.
Ali ni Samuel u ovom trenutku Samuel nije sasvim dobar.
He set up a very bad situation by trying to put his evil sons in control.
Zapravo je on stvorio ovu lošu situaciju jer je pokušao nametnuti svoje sinove koji nisu bili prihvatljivi za vode.
There's some mess on both sides here.
Dakle, ovdje imamo situaciju koja je zbrkana na obje strane.
So if you just read this and you're like, okay, where's right and where's wrong, where's good and where's bad, like I want to color code my Bible where there's the good guys and the bad guys.
I ako želite ovdje označiti ko je dobar, ko je loš bojom, ako želite u Bibliji označiti jednom bojom dobre, a drugom bojom loše, nećete moći.
It's hard to do right here.
Ovdje je to dosta teško.
So faithful history is truthful even when it's confusing.
Dakle, ta prava, vjerna istina je istinita i čak kad je zbunjujuća.
But also, the faithful history affirms that God is sovereign in the midst of history.
Takva ista vjerna povijest potvrđuje da je Bog suveren u sred te povijesti koja se događa.
God is actually acting in history.
Bog djeluje u povijesti.
In the big picture, he is working for his purposes, and we can be confident in that.
I u velikoj slici on djeluje u skladu sa svojim namjerama, sa svojom voljom i možemo u to biti sigurni.
Very famous example of this is how God takes away his blessing from Saul as king and says, I'm going to give the kingdom to someone else.
I poznati primjer je taj gdje Bog oduzima blagoslov od kralja Šaula i kaže da ću ga nekom drugom.
This is 1 Samuel 15:27.
To je u 1. Samuelovoj 15:27.
Samuel has told Saul that he's rejected, and so now, as Samuel turned to leave, Saul caught hold of the hem of his robe, and it tore. And Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you. He who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a human being that he should change his mind.
Kad se Samuel okrenuo da ode, Šaul čvrsto uhvati skut njegova plašta, ali se skut otkide. Tada mu reče Samuel, danas ti je Jahve otkinuo kraljevstvo nad Izraelom i dao ga tvome susjedu koji je bolji od tebe. Ipak slava Izraelova ne laže i ne kaje se, jer nije čovjek da bi se kajao.
God is at work. He is bringing things to his purposes in history.
Bog djeluje i on sve stvari dovodi da budu u skladu s njegovom voljom i njegovom namjerom u povijesti.
We don't have to be sort of desperate and think that our country made 10 wrong turns in the last 100 years and we're so far away from anywhere where God wanted to be that we're just damned.
Ne moramo se brinuti razmišljajući kako je naša zemlja napravila 10 krivih poteza u zadnjih nekoliko godina i sad je jako daleko i svi smo propali.
That God is at work in history.
Bog djeluje u povijesti.
And lastly, and I think this is where it starts to get really interesting, that faithful history moves us from very simplistic understandings to being sympathetic.
Zadnji primjer koji govori o tome kako ta vjerna povijest nam pomaže da ne budemo nekakvog jednostavnog uma, nego da imamo suosjećanje za ljude.
And a great example of this is in 2 Samuel chapter 9.
I dobar primjer ovoga je u drugoj Samuelovoj knjizi, u 9. poglavlju.
Remember, Saul persecutes David for a very long time.
Ako se sjećate, Šaul je jako dugo proganjao Davida.
And then Saul dies, and there's a few years when one of Saul's children and sons is able to be king, and then he...
I nakon Šaulove smrti, nekoliko godina jedan od njegovih sinova je njega naslijedio.
And then David takes over the kingship.
A onda nakon toga David preuzima kraljevstvo.
And once he's established as king, he asks this following question.
I kad je se ustoličio kao kralj, pita sljedeće pitanje.
David asks, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Jonathan was Saul's son and David's best friend.
I dakle u prvom stihu 9. poglavlja David pita. Jednoga dana upita David, ima li još koji preživjeli od Šaulove kuće da mu učini milost zbog Jonatana? Jonatan je Šaulov sin koji je bio Davidov jako dobar prijatelj.
Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? At your service, he replied. And the king asked, is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? And Ziba answered the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet. Where is he? The king asked. Ziba answered, he is at the house of Machir, son of Amiel in Lo-debar. So King David had him brought from Lo-debar, from the house of Machir, son of Amiel. And when Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. And David said, Mephibosheth, at your service, he replied. Do not be afraid, David said to him, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table.
Dakle, dalje nastavljamo od 2. stiha do 7. A bijaše u Šaulovoj kući sluga po imenu Siba. Njega dozaše pred Davida i kralj ga upita, jesi li ti Siba? A on odgovori, jesam, tvoj sluga. A kralj nastavi, zar nema više nikoga od Šaulove kuće da mu iskaže milost kao što je Božja milost? A Siba odgovori kralju, ima još Jonatanov sin koji je hrom na obje noge. Kralj ga upita, gdje je on? A Siba odgovori kralju, eno ga u kući Makira, sina Amijelova, u Lo-debaru. Tada kralj David posla po njega u kuću Makira, sina Amijelova, iz Lo-debara. Kad je Meri-Baal, sin Jonatana, sina Šaulova, došao k Davidu, pade ničice i pokloni se, a David reče, Meri-Baale. On odgovori, evo tvoga sluge. A David mu reče, ne boj se jer ti želim iskazati milost zbog tvoga oca Jonatana. Vratit ću ti sva polja tvoga djeda Šaula, a ti ćeš svagda jesti kruh za mojim stolom.
There are multiple examples in this book where someone comes to David thinking he's going to be really excited to hear the news of the fall of his enemies.
Ima jako puno primjera u ovoj knjizi gdje netko dođe Davidu i govori, misli da će David biti vesel kad čuje da se nešto loše dogodilo njegovim neprijateljima.
And that actually doesn't, you don't want to be the guy who comes to tell David that somebody from Benjamin has died.
A zapravo istina je da ne želite biti čovjek koji će doći Davidu i reći da je netko od Benjaminovaca poginuo.
David is so extreme in this that at one point his very cold general Joab tells him the following.
I čak David je toliko ekstreman u tome da u jednom trenutku kad mu Joab, jedan od njegovih generala, kaže
You love those who hate you and hate those who love you.
Kažu mu, ti voliš one koji te mrze, a mrziš one koji te vole.
You're crazy.
Lud si.
But that's the kind of person you see David's character coming out in various points in this book.
I takva je osoba David, njegov karakter izlazi iz ovih scena kroz knjigu.
You also see the author bringing out those kinds of details that show sympathy for the losers.
I vidite da autor zapravo iznosi takve detalje koji pokazuju suosjećanje za gubitnike.
And I think then as we read this book from the New Testament, one thing that comes clear is that also that faithful history ends up somehow pointing to the person of Jesus Christ.
I čitajući ove knjige u Starom Zavjetu, shvaćamo da ta vjerni prikaz povijesti zapravo uvijek pokazuje prema osobi Isusa Krista.
It shows that there's this deep thirst that history leads somewhere.
Pokazuje tu duboku žeđ, da postoji ta duboka žeđ i da povijest nekamo vodi.
There's a confidence that God is actually doing something.
Da postoji to pouzdanje da Bog stvarno nešto radi.
While also a clear awareness of how messed up a lot of things are.
Ali isto tako tu je i jasna svjesnost toga da su stvari jako potrgane, loše.
And a lot of it has to do with the hope of birth.
A puno toga zapravo ima s tom nadom u rođenje.
Because Hannah prays a prayer of victory when she finds out that she is going to have a baby.
Jer Ana, nakon što je saznala da je trudna, moli ovu molitvu pobjede.
And she saw in there more than just her own victory. She talks about the poor being vindicated through her own.
I ona tu vidi i kroz tu molitvu izražava ne samo nekakvu svoju osobnu molitvu, nego i vidi nekakvu pobjedu slabih, siromašnih i potlačenih.
And 1,000 years later, when Mary becomes pregnant,
1000 godina nakon toga kad je Marija trudna,
and she prays her Magnificat,
i ona moli svoj Magnifikat.
She is quoting in several parts of her prayer. She's quoting Hannah because that's where she looks back.
I ona na nekim mjestima svoje molitve zapravo citira Anu i sjeća se njene molitve.
She also realizes God is doing something for everyone through her pregnancy.
I ona shvaća da Bog čini nešto za sve kroz njenu molitvu, kroz njenu trudnoću.
You can read through Samuel and see all these points at which leaders failed.
Možete čitajući kroz Samuela vidjeti mnoge situacije gdje su vođe podbacile, gdje su pogriješile.
And then you read the life of Jesus and he never failed.
I onda možete čitati o Isusu koji nije nikada.
And never let people down.
Koji nije nikada ljude iznevjerio.
He sent a power that was actually able to lift up his followers so that they could continue.
Već je poslao Duha Svetoga da može osnažiti njegove sljedbenike da oni mogu nastaviti.
And I think this book then can help us both to be more honest about the way we read our own history.
Ova nam knjiga može pomoći da budemo iskreniji u tome kako čitamo povijest, kako gledamo na povijest.
And then when we come to the things we just don't know what to do with.
I kad dođemo do stvari gdje ne znamo što s njima, kako dalje.
We're able in those to point our hearts to Christ and to see that He can fill the things that humanity has never been able to fix.
Možemo se okrenuti prema Kristu i shvatiti da On je taj koji može ispuniti stvari koje čovječanstvo nikad nije moglo.
And we can learn to listen to stories that make us uncomfortable.
I možemo se naučiti slušati priče zbog kojih se osjećamo neudobno.
When I was in high school, I had this advanced history class where we wouldn't just read like a big history book, but we would read a lot of actual speeches and documents.
Kad sam bio u srednjoj školi imali smo nekakav napredni predmet za napredne, gdje smo čitali ne samo povijesne knjige, nego i različite govore različitih ljudi i takve stvari.
So one of the things we did was we read a speech that Abraham Lincoln gave when he was running for president in 1860.
I tako smo jednom čitali govor koji je Abraham Lincoln održao kad je bio u trci za predsjednika. Koje godine?
1860.
1860.
This was before the Civil War starts.
Dakle, prije nego što je počeo civilni rat.
He went down to the South to campaign.
I bio je na jugu Amerike da promovira tu svoju kampanju.
And hoping that at least somebody down there would vote for him. He knew he wasn't going to get a lot of votes.
I nadao se da će bar netko tamo glasati. Za njega znao da neće dobiti puno glasova.
But because he was trying to present himself sympathetically.
Ali pokušao se prikazati na način koji da bi oni mogli imati suosjećanje.
So he says in this very embarrassing speech, he says, I know that black people will never be the equal of white people.
I u tom jednom govoru, koji je dosta na neki način sramotan, kaže, ja znam da crnci nikada neće biti jednaki bijelcima.
And I remember one friend of mine in that class, she cried when she read this.
I sjećam se jedna moja prijateljica, kad je to čula, se rasplakala.
And she said, I can never ever respect him again.
I rekla je, ja ga nikad više sad ne mogu više cijeniti.
I can't believe that he would think something like that.
Ne mogu vjerovati da bi on tako nešto mislio.
It's like I've been lied to that he was a hero.
I osjećam se kao da su mi lagali kad su mi rekli da je on nekav heroj.
And I think that is very easy for us to be either unable to hear or so brittle that we break when we hear hard things.
I mislim da je nama lako biti ili nesposobni da čujemo takve stvari ili kad ih čujemo da se skroz kršimo.
But it doesn't have to be that way.
Ali ne mora biti tako.
Lincoln was a flawed figure of his time.
Lincoln je sigurno imao svojih nedostataka.
He lived as a product of his own day and time and thought thoughts that were normal to think that.
Bio je normalan proizvod svog vremena, dakle razmišljao na način na koji je bilo normalno razmišljati tad.
But when you look at what he did even given all of that.
Ali kad razmišljate što je učinio usprkos svemu tome.
And along the way his views actually changed a lot during the Civil War itself.
I kroz sam taj rat njegovi su se pogledi mijenjali.
And became more and more aware of what needed to happen and what justice really meant.
I postao je sve više svjestan toga što se treba dogoditi i što znači pravednost.
We can recognize the greatness of our heroes.
Mi možemo prepoznati veličinu naših heroja.
And also not be afraid of admitting what their flaws were.
Ali isto tako ne smijemo se bojati priznati što su njihove mane i nedostaci, koje su im slabosti.
Because when I talk to people and I talk to Americans, I talk to Croatians about the good and the bad, that's a mix in various important figures.
Kad razgovaram i s Amerikancima i s Hrvatima, s raznim ljudima o tom miksu dobroga i lošega u poznatim osobama.
It's more and more like, I don't even want to hear about that. That's just a lie from some...
Često se zapravo dogodi da ljudi kažu, ma ja uopće ne želim ni čuti o tome, to je laž, to sigurno nije istina.
That's communist propaganda.
To je komunistička propaganda.
No one even wants to have the conversation anymore.
Nitko zapravo nije spreman razgovarati.
It's me and the 200 people on the internet who agree with me and I'm confident in that.
I to sam ja i 200 ljudi na internetu koji se sa mnom slažu.
I think it's very interesting that this book did not just succeed to become part of the Bible.
I zanimljivo je da ova knjiga ne samo da je uspjela u tome da postane dio Biblije.
I think it succeeded in its original goal.
Mislim da je zapravo ispunila svoj originalni cilj.
In helping to reconcile Benjamin and Judah.
I pomogla je u pomirbi između Benjamina i Jude.
The reason I say that is this.
A razlog zašto to kažem je ovaj.
You know, as the story of the Old Testament goes along, eventually the kingdom is divided and we read in Kings and Chronicles about Judah and about the northern kingdom.
I kako priča ide, znamo da se na kraju to kraljevstvo podijelilo na sjeverno i odnosno na Izrael i na južno kraljevstvo.
But Judah is sort of a shorthand.
Ali Juda nema snage.
No, it's not just the tribe of Judah.
Dakle, Juda nije samo pleme Judino.
It's Judah and Benjamin.
Zapravo radi se o Judi i Benjaminu zajedno.
Benjamin sticks with Judah in the long run.
Jer Benjamin ustrajava uz Judu na duge staze.
And the other 10 tribes are taken off into captivity, never to be heard from again.
i drugih 10 plemena je odvedeno u izgnanstvo i nikad se za njih više nije čulo.
But Benjamin stays with Judah, so when Benjamin is brought back from the exile the way Judah also is.
Ali Benjamin ostaje uz Judu i kad su se vratili iz izgnanstva, vratili su se i Benjaminovci i Judini zajedno.
And who's our great hero who's a Benjamin?
A ko je naš veliki heroj koji je Benjaminovac?
Paul.
Pavao.
And what's his original name?
Kako se on originalno zvao?
Saul.
Šaul ili Savao je kod nas.
So the Benjamites didn't forget King Saul. They're 1,000 years later they were giving their sons the name Saul.
Dakle, Benjaminovci nisu zaboravili svoga kralja Šaula i nakon 1000 godina još uvijek daju svojoj djeci njegovo ime.
And I know this is just a guess, but I think that this book probably helped make peace between Benjamin and Judah.
I ovo je nekakva moja pretpostavka, ali mislim da ova knjiga, način na koji je napisana, je pomogla da se pomire Benjaminovci i Judejci.
I highly recommend this book to you.
Ja vam je jako toplo preporučam.
If you read it closely and slowly and carefully,
ako je čitate pažljivo i sporo,
it can help you to become more confident that God's in charge, but also more patient to listen to the stuff that makes you uncomfortable.
Može vam pomoći da budete uvjereni u to da Bog je taj koji vlada nad svim, ali isto tako vam može pomoći da imate više strpljenja slušati stvari zbog kojih se osjećate neugodno.
It'll help you become more sympathetic to others.
I da budete suosjećajniji prema drugima.
While still being able to say what the Bible calls best.
Dok još uvijek nastavljate govoriti i vjerovati u ono što Biblija zove najboljim.
Today, most public discussion, and it's going on in politics right now in Croatia, is about a race to claim the status of victim.
Danas puno naših političkih razgovora i ovo gdje se sada Hrvatska nalazi je kao nekakva utrka da se proglasite žrtvom.
Like you think you're a victim, you're making me a victim by your...
Ako misliš da si ti žrtva, ti zapravo meni činiš žrtvom zbog toga što ti i šta već.
This book can help us be free from that, to say, I don't need to think of myself as a victim.
Ova knjiga nam može pomoći da razmišljamo na način da kažemo ja ne moram o sebi razmišljati kao o žrtvi.
But I'm curious to hear why you think you're a victim.
Ali rado ću čuti zašto ti misliš da si ti žrtva.
And I think when you read this, you see where the holes are and you see the things that absolutely demanded that Jesus come and save us.
I dok čitate ovo, jasne su vam te rupe zbog kojih je bilo neophodno da Isus dođe da nas spasi.
And he came as the one of the line of David.
I on je došao kao jedan iz Davidove linije.
Who never failed his followers.
Koji nije nikad iznevjerio svoje sljedbenike.
He came as the prophet who never spoke wrongly.
Kao prorok koji nikad nije govorio krivo.
And his glory comes through clearly as well when you see what needed to be still needed to happen.
I njegova slava izlazi kroz sve to što je bilo jasno da se mora tek dogoditi.
And I think that can be great encouragement to us in a time when just division and nastiness is just the word of the day in Western culture.
I nadam se da nam ovo može biti veliko ohrabrenje kad pogledamo na našu zapadnu kulturu gdje je sve gdje je sve podijeljeno i gdje non stop su nekakva previranja i svađe.
Thank you.
Hvala.